Good morning, everyone. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here coming to you today from UCCA Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing. I'm Philip Tinari, Director and Chief Executive of this institution. And it's a specific pleasure and honor to be part of the Martin-Roth-Symposium, having had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Roth a bit during his travels in China throughout his career. Our topic today is museums and the future. And I think often when we address this topic, we're thinking of it more from a technological angle and asking about the impact of things like virtual reality and augmented reality and new kinds of digital technologies on our museological practice. But I today wanted to change a bit the frame of that conversation and think more about museums and the future in terms of the rhetorical and cultural and political and discursive frameworks which museums as institutions imply. I think UCCA is very well situated to engage in this conversation. UCCA was established in 2007 by a Belgian collector of Chinese contemporary art by the name of Guy Ullens, and situated inside a set of factory chambers designed by East German architects, built with Soviet capital, located on the outskirts of Beijing in 1957, which were then transformed just 5 decades later into an art district. And much of the conversation around China in the period leading up to our founding, basically from the late 1970s until the time around the Olympics, the Beijing Olympics in 2008, often revolved around this idea that economic reform and growth would lead China to a new kind of political system and subjectivity. It's a dynamic I've sometimes called the great teleology of capitalism bringing democracy. And in this kind of a framework, the museum, especially coming from a Western perspective, has a very specific function, which is as a place, an institution dedicated to the cultivation and education of a democratic citizenry. And of course, as we've seen in the years since 2008, specifically with the financial crisis, and all of the developments culminating most recently in COVID and the various responses to it, China traveled a very different path. And that actually leads us to ask ourselves as an institution, what kind of role we are left to play in this society. We see ourselves as a museum of contemporary art, a museum, of course, without a collection, in our case, a Kunsthalle, a temporary museum in many ways, that sits outside of what I would call the two overarching narratives of political and consumer subjectivity. So we are neither an official nor a straightforwardly economic or commercial space. We are instead a space for a kind of open and human encounter, and a place in which, through the presentation of objects and images by different artists, we attempt to articulate a kind of global worldview and subjectivity. Many institutions in the West are currently confronting questions around diversity and decolonization. And these are, of course, conversations that we follow very, very closely and that we learn from and are inspired by as ingrained practices and problems are addressed. However, this dynamic of decolonization applies quite differently to an institution that has no collection and that has already undergone this transition from its foreign owners to a new set of Chinese trustees and backers, and that throughout this whole period has managed to retain a kind of independence and to sit outside of the Communist Party system per se. It does, however, lead us to ask ourselves certain questions about what are our references and what are our benchmarks, and how do we attempt to improve ourselves as an institution functioning in this special context at this special time. To give a specific example, we closed our doors on January 19th for Chinese New Year and did not reopen until May 20th, having been shut down as institutions all over the world later came to be for what was here the core of the pandemic period. However, we were asked, starting in the middle of March, sort of with a hint that we would be able to reopen in late May, to organize an exhibition on very short notice. And using 8 weeks, we put together a group show of 26 artists of works separated into different sections, reflecting in different ways on this global pandemic situation. It was an interesting experience for us as an institution, because for so many years, as we've evolved and matured in these 13 years that we've existed, we've always been attempting to extend our timelines and to implement more what we consider kind of international best practices, which would mean, starting to work on an exhibition 2 or 3 or even 4 years in advance, and approaching it according to a very regimented timeline. It was an interesting discovery for us that this Chinese condition of things happening very quickly, in a way at the last minute, was actually for us a source of strength and power as we attempted to confront these unexpected circumstances. And something that I think is sort of in our DNA of being able to do things this quickly, if we compare to something like a situation we saw just this week at the Whitney in New York, where another very quickly planned exhibition managed to set off some unwanted questions and to raise some uncomfortable dynamics. Another example I'd like to give is of an exhibition that we just opened a week ago with the American painter Elizabeth Peyton. An artist who, like all of the foreign artists we choose to show, has a level of connection to the Chinese conversation through her love of stories and narratives, but also through her insistence on figurative painting, which is a trend in art making that has remained key to certainly education and formation here in a way that for her, it was a more rebellious or not an obvious choice coming out of New York in the 1990s. Now, what's interesting about mounting an exhibition of Elizabeth Peyton's work during the middle of a pandemic is that the exhibition must be installed remotely. And paradoxically, although the artist cannot be present and is not able to engage with the audience and the media in the ways that we typically think of as good, it also endows the artwork itself with a new kind of power and significance. As we look to the future, we think a lot about building a network across China. We're going to open another location in Shanghai at the end of the year. We currently also operate a second location by the beach in Beidaihe, about 300 kilometers from Beijing. And we have our eyes on a number of other cities with the hopes of creating what's really a community of contemporary art that exists as a string of institutions in major cities, mounting top quality exhibitions, but that also exists as a digital community of people engaging with and learning about artistic practices through a series of courses, through a program of content, and through a set of interactions that's delivered and mediated by their phones, essentially. What will this look like, and how will it relate not just to the people actually using it, but to this community and this society that's at once Chinese and global? And what lessons might that have for us as global museum practitioners? That's what I'll share for the moment. And I look forward to seeing you all in my deep dive in a little while.